So I'm going to formally introduce myself. My name is Ariel Clark. I am an attorney and an activist. I'm a founding partner of Clark Howell LLP. We're a sponsor of this event. I'm also co-general legal counsel with Jakruna. And I'm very, very excited to be here. Today's discussion is on race relations, psychedelics, and the need for empathy in a racist society. And I'm so very pleased that we have Darren Smith with us here today. Just to give everyone a bit of background, Darren Smith is a NCCPA certified physician assistant and a faculty member in the Department of Sociology at the University of Memphis. His areas of research and scholarship examine US-based systems of racial oppression and systemic inequality found in all domains across society, including healthcare, the family, healthcare disparities, religion, sport, culture, and politics. Dr. Smith's current research and practice intertwine the study of neurosociology, race-based trauma, and mental illness by looking at the impact of neurofeedback versus MDMA-assisted therapy on brainwave activity in individuals with racial trauma using EEG technology. Dr. Smith is a member of Jacruna's Racial Equity and Access Committee. And Dr. Smith, I will turn it over to you and I will exit until the Q&A, which will be in about a half an hour.
Okay. Thank you, Ariel, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, everyone, and to be with you and to be able to make these remarks. I hope that whatever I say or the things that I say will be taken in the spirit that it was intended, and that these ideas that I put forward are helpful in some way as we, contemplate our existence in the world, and we look around our world and see these calamitous events unfolding before us. Much of them man-made, and certainly, and much of it can be also, restructured so that life is more fair and equitable. But one of the reasons for this presentation has to do with my experience teaching, for many years teaching, white students in predominantly white states, where issues and matters of race were hardly ever discussed. And as such, many of the students that I've taught over the years just really didn't have a way to sort of conceptualize or even understand, the issues that they, were just taken for granted in much of the time. And so, after so many years of doing this and having and seeing and learning from my students, as well as trying to impart something tangible for them to learn, how to be more fully human, I came across some very interesting ideas that I'd like to share with you about, the idea of race relations. We talk about race relations, and I also want to make you a bit uncomfortable, but in the most humble way as possible, and in an instructive way, so that it might, sort of prompt or promulgate people to want to be better and do better. And also, I think that psychedelics plays a significant role in this, and helping us to get to that imagined community that Dr. King talked about so often in his remarks. So race relations, as you all know, remains a contemporary problem in the United States. I would, be remiss if I didn't say that it remains an inherently white problem, because if we look at the history of it, and we'll talk a little bit about this as we go forward, the history speaks for itself. And so if we're about evidence-based approaches to knowledge and understanding, then we have to really take seriously into account the history of the United States and the way in which our society has really yet to atone for its role in large-scale land theft of indigenous peoples, and of course labor theft from enslaved Africans, and the ramifications and the destruction to the communities that these violent events and acts engendered. Without a national truth and reconciliation, with these acts in mind, the pathway towards social justice, will really remain, a dream, that Dr. King, spoke about and envisioned for his children and our society. One of the remarks that often cut, spliced, reinvented, reconditioned ideas that Dr. King put forward was this notion of being a person being judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. So that's often been interpreted as the color blindness clause, right? The idea that that the idea was taken largely out of context and sort of embodied and adopted by whites of goodwill who often profess that they don't see color. I don't see color. I just see a person in front of me. So it might sound like an intelligent remark, but if you look at the evolution of that remark, Homo sapiens don't see. Homo sapiens we see and we have cones and rods, and both of these highly specialized photoreceptive cells enable us to see color vision and black and white vision. So unless you have a medical diagnosis that says that you're colorblind in the medical sense of the term, then everybody sees color vision, right? So to deny what you don't see is really not a good strategy, a good winning strategy. But yet it's been used repeatedly over and over again, in part so that folks will, really, it's sort of this idea that if I say I'm colorblind and that that's enough to end racism, right, in America. And let me be clear when I say racism, I'm speaking specifically about structural, institutional types racism. These, the way in which history has shaped and patterned our institutions, our business institutions, our legal system, our healthcare system, and all of the major sectors and domains in society have been impacted by, centuries-old racism and discrimination. So 256 years of chattel slavery followed by another 100 years of Jim Crow. And now we're living in a near Jim Crow or near slavery-like condition, particularly when you look at the continued violent acts committed against largely unarmed Black people in this country by law enforcement, which many in the research industry, many in the industry where I work at would say that this has reached an epidemic proportion. And this epidemic has scourged the society in numerous ways, not to mention the deep trauma that it has caused for African Americans and other communities of color who witness this and who have to live with the aftermath of these horrific scenes that we often see play out in primetime news. So when we talk about how race relations is really a white problem, we have to look at the idea of racial socialization and this notion of how white people were sort of taught to be white, and how these ideas about difference were essentially handed down from their forebearers, right? Now, a lot of ways, well, I don't feel this way, or some white people say, oh, I don't feel this way, or I don't feel this way. Let me tell you, you may not actually feel this way, but let me tell you why it's important to understand this. And hopefully when we get to the end of this, it'll make more sense to you. Because the idea of, and this is where, before I go there, let me say this. This is where our long-held notion of individualism, the idea that, we work hard, we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we've gotten here because of all of our own personal effort, right? This idea of individualism makes it very hard for people to see the collective experiences of marginalized communities. Right, we talk about the BIPOC community and the deep pain and the deep suffering that so many members of those communities experience and live with. Not to mention the intergenerational trauma that has been handed forward and refashioned within the biological systems in the form of epigenetic transference, and the way in which these conditions influence the mind and affect the brain, specifically specific brain patterns in our head that help us to be able to understand the world in intelligent ways, to help us to be able to think, help us to be able to do calculations, to help us to be able to inhibit our emotional fire center, the amygdala, particularly in the right side of our right hemisphere. These processes interact with our understanding, our epistemology of the world, the way that we see ourselves in the world. And largely in part, the main mantra of understanding, the worldview that predominates our understanding, is individualism, right? And you should all know, if you don't know, I'll remind you that our species Homo sapiens, of which we are 99.9% similar. And our mother, our first mother, that is Lucy, who was discovered in Africa, about 3 foot tall. We all share the same DNA as Lucy, mtDNA. So she's our first mother. These ideas that we have about difference and the ways in which we've been socialized to see difference have also consequences on white Americans, in that white Americans are somewhat forced to congeal and contort themselves into this box we know as individualism. Now, people of color are not immune from this as well, of course. You know, these ideas are transferred to folks of color as well, the BIPOC community, and we are left to sort of deal with it. You know, much of the time we spend reframing these devastating ideas that have been proffered by members of the what we know now as the white community and their forebearers, particularly the genesis being Northern Europeans, who often saw themselves as the most enlightened of all whites, and Eastern and Southern Europeans being the worst. Probably the worst white of them all was the Irish. The Irish had a particular nasty taste and disdain for those who were from the Northern European nation states, and the religious beliefs that underscored these differences or these perceived differences. So not all white people are created equally as well. And the vast majority of whites that did come here were poor whites who were looking for opportunities at having access to land and what the land could do in terms of the production of wealth generating resources and opportunities. The vast majority of whites in this country lived as vagrants and spirited themselves to and fro off different people's lands, scallywags as you were. And the vast majority of whites during this particular period of time in our history could not find jobs that would sustain them, because labor was free largely, particularly in the southern states, but also in other colonies, middle colonies, not so much in the northern colonies. So this experience and this socialization, we often take for granted. And the story of America as a nation where individuals exist and where individuals are working out their own existence just doesn't fly with evolution. Our species, we evolved as groups. We evolved as collectives. It was very rare for individuals to be walking around by themselves during the early period of our human our human endeavors as we eclipsed other humanoid species. We evolved to be a shared species. We evolved to have relationships. That's one of the reasons why humans, Homo sapiens, have survived all these generations and will continue to evolve as our brains continue to evolve. But these experiences have not been taught, have not really been a part of the curriculum. We don't really teach necessarily truth, but rather we teach a political reflection of truth from the perspective of the victors of history. And so that history then, that understanding those stories, those narratives then get taken up into the popular discourse, the dominant domain. And the most pernicious and pervasive ones, as you already know, the ideas that people of color are different than those who are considered to be white, right? Different athletically, different in terms of intelligence, different in terms of sexuality and degree of friskiness or promiscuity, the idea that people of color aren't to be trusted, and of course, one of the more pernicious ideas, the idea that people of color are dangerous, inherently dangerous, which is a common theme that you hear play out in these police-involved shootings. I specifically remember the one in Minnesota when Philando Castile was gunned down in front of his girlfriend and their child in the back seat. the officer who pulled the trigger said he was afraid, he looked dangerous, he looked like he was going to do something. Of course, the Darren Wilson case with Michael Brown and Ferguson, Darren Wilson indicated that Michael Brown looked like a demon. Such ideas and such narratives about Black people has been part of the anti-Black narrative for generations, for centuries, and it still surfaces and percolates within society. Even though whites of goodwill may not believe these ideas, it doesn't mean that society isn't shaped by them. An example of this would be consider who you marry. Most people marry people who look like themselves. Consider the neighborhoods in which we live in. Most people live in very segregated communities. Consider the schools where we attend. Most people attend highly segregated schools, and on and on. Consider the dual criminal justice system. Consider the dual healthcare systems that we have in this country. If COVID didn't expose that, then I'm not sure what did. COVID broke the veneer, or exposed what was already rotting beneath, the deep disparities that exist within healthcare in this country. So all of these experiences speak to a condition, an idea that's deeply embedded within the white psyche. If you really understand this and really recognize this to be the issue at hand, right, it really makes it easier then to try to figure out ways to address it. How can we address it? Well, it's very difficult to do so, particularly when these ideas are cemented, and also there are frames surrounded. There are frames which surround these ideas, these ideologies that are protective, right? One is white defensiveness. Many of you maybe have heard of a book by a scholar by the name of Robin DiAngelo. And Robin DiAngelo, her work is very, very reader friendly and easy to understand, but it's not a new concept. This idea that white defensiveness is largely what keeps the institutions, systemic racism, in check, or keeps it continuous in society. So this defensiveness is deployed whenever whites are their position in life is challenged, right? This idea of even this discussion and talking about individualism, this idea that I worked hard to get to where I am today, even that is a triggering discussion for many whites to have. The idea of ongoing police killings in this country, and the differences between how white Americans, when polled and surveyed, see police shootings in respect to African Americans. The differences are striking. Or when one considers the ways in which stereotypes, when polled in national surveys, continue to surface, and when you also consider the degree of which discrimination is manifested in the large degree of phone calls that the EEOC receives yearly around issues of discrimination in the workplace. And the overwhelming, the oldest, most severely discriminated against group in this country is African Americans, those who are descendants of slaves, whose ancestors were forced here between the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. So the idea that society is what it is, and that culture, and that our understanding of the world, knowledge, the books that we read, the friendships that we have, all the things that we enjoy, speaks to the existence of white Americans. And when someone challenges these assumptions, it tends to draw the ire in some and many white Americans. Not all, certainly, but a great deal. If the events that transpired on January 6th wasn't enough for you, consider the history, the 400-year-old history of the United States and its evolution, and the myth-making that took place, right, to forge an identity that was largely based upon myths and innuendos, and sometimes outright lies. But in order to have that atonement, And in order to have that reconciliation that I mentioned earlier, it takes this sort of deconstruction in sort of a derealized sort of way, right? It takes, I think, getting to understanding, or at least having some understanding of the mass delusion that seems to prevail when issues of race are front and center, such as what we're seeing right now and what's playing out right now nationally for us. And I think until we reconcile our past, or reconcile our contemporary realities, will continue to dog us as a society and continue to cause great harm and suffering amongst those who are members of the BIPOC community. So what can we do as a result of this? What can be done to heal beyond understanding the ways in which racial socialization and the histories that we tell ourselves, must be completely reread and completely taught differently. And these lessons should begin much earlier when children become aware of race, which is generally around the ages of 3 to 5 years of age, is when children recognize racial differences. But they generally recognize physical disabilities first, followed by race, then gender. And so when children become aware of this, we as a society have to mandate that children are taught our racial history, and that this history be taught primarily by people of good faith, but also largely people of color who've been left out and left behind these discussions for far too long, right? And that we tell the truth about America, and we tell the truth about its primary dominant force and its primary dominant force of oppression, which would be white supremacy. If I say white supremacy and the crowd and the audience bristles at that feeling of disdain or distaste or angst is precisely the kind of healing that needs to happen, right? It's the kind of, it would be a good biomarker that we need to begin to do some truth-telling work, to work on so many of the defenses that Robin DiAngelo talks about, that white people deploy when discussing these issues. I know it's tough. It's not easy, because essentially people have to look at their own families, the people that they love, the stories that they've said, the racist uncles, the racist aunts, and all of these people who we look up to and that we often revere, right? We begin to look at them and have to sort of consider, these histories, these personal histories that we all know, right? But I would say to you and submit to you, where would white people have learned these lessons, these anti-racist lessons? In what venue would these lessons be taught generally by, in the white community, larger white community, when there's remained so much significant ignorance around these issues, and largely from the white community, but also from members of the BIPOC community as well, because they often get their information from larger white sources, right? Those that are empowered, those that have the resources to put forth knowledge and truth in many forms, in the national media and so in social media and in the curriculum from high school to college. And so all, as I indicated earlier, all of these experiences and all of these truth-telling moments speak to the existence of white people at the expense of everybody else, right? Which we know that's simply not the case. So as we look at what has to happen, this brings up a really fruitful area for psychedelic work, because psychedelic work could provide a very, very fruitful pathway to be able to have these sorts of important dialogues with people who are trained to do these things that can actually help, I think, spirit or help help white people as they sort of go through these moments, these very deep moments that they have really never thought about much before, or maybe thought about not knowing what to do, in the process. Or how do I get to a place where I'm not so angry about these issues, where I can actually have a rational conversation that might change the landscape of the nation in positive ways that we haven't seen yet. So on that note, Ariel's back, which tells me that we're moving into a question and answer session, which makes me really angry in a nice sort of way, because I haven't gotten all my remarks out yet.
Oh, well, would you like to take a couple more minutes and then we can come back for questions?
I'm joking. I'm joking. Oh. I'm joking.
I believed you. You're a persuasive person. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So, what you were just discussing about psychedelic supported spaces and the potential for value there. There is a question in the chat about specifically that. What value do psychedelics have in those sort of supported spaces when we engage in anti-oppression and anti-racism work? Do you see value, and what does that look like?
So what we know from social science research is that whites as a group, not individual whites within the sound of my voice necessarily, but whites as a large group have less empathy for BIPOC members than they do for their own group. And these studies have been done in France, they've been done in the United States, and they reveal similar truths that the Good Samaritan rule, as often put forward in the Christian world, it doesn't necessarily apply to people of color. So having psychedelic experiences with psilocybin, for instance, or even MDMA, I think will create moments where whites can talk about these issues and be able to have specific insights into these issues, where the ego is not driving the discussion, but the ego is melted away. In a sense that these conversations that often anger people, right? Fruitful discussions can happen, and that real change can happen within the individual who's going through these experiences. I'm very much in favor of having experiences where we bring whites of good faith and goodwill together in these spaces. And people say, well, people of color don't, these white people need to do this work too. Yes, they do. And I think that that's certainly the case, because working with whites who are angry all the time is not necessarily my cup of tea. It can be very stressful, but yet somebody has to do it. And so, to me, I consider myself not in a conceited sort of way, uniquely positioned for that because of my background, and working with some of the most resistant whites who are far to the right as right can go, and having these conversations and being able to have some really major breakthroughs. So I think there's a way to do it. In fact, I think Dr. Monica Williams is one of my dear colleagues who was actually on the same committee that I serve with here at the organization. And she has written extensively about racial trauma and how white supremacy and white ignorance, frankly, is very traumatizing and very, very destructive for communities of color, and how we need to sort of do something beyond just policy making to make those changes. The changes need to start with individuals. Then, of course, that is then translated into groups and so on and so forth. So we need to have these experiences where whites come together and that they feel comfortable sharing their experiences in a safe place, in a safe environment, about how race has impacted their lives, for the better and for the worst, and how we might move forward in more meaningful ways. Listen, the BIPOC community cannot do this without white people. There's just no way that it can work without white people. The only way that I can envision it working is basically no way, simply because whites have too much power, too much influence, too much, they own too much of everything. So the goal would then be to develop, inspire, help those who are sort of like, how can I be better? What can I do personally? Those individuals who are probably not at this talk right now, to come, to come in and to be willing and courageous enough to have these difficult conversations. But I think that having MDMA on board or having psilocybin on board might make it even more powerful, even more enriching, even more necessary and transformative, frankly. And with the main focus on being teaching our white brothers and sisters how to develop more empathy for those that they don't often interact with much, through no fault of their own. I say this because most whites within the sound of my voice, y'all didn't ask for any of this, neither did I. But yet here we are. And this is what we've inherited. So we have to do something affirmative rather than nothing.
Thank you. And we've got a lot of questions, so I'll do my best to get through a number of them. There's a notable amount of research which concludes that BIPOC would do well to consume psychedelic medicines in order to treat the psycho-emotional effects of racial trauma, but I have not seen any research concluding that members of white culture would do well to take psychedelics to treat white supremacy, which I think is the form of delusional disorder.
Whoever said that, hey, I'm with you. That's precisely what I'm talking about. So, and when I mentioned in the discussion earlier, mass delusion, that's what I meant. So this idea of not having empathy, white empathy, or the lack thereof in respects to people, BIPOC people. Again, I'm talking about whites as a group, not as individuals. So if you're upset about the individual remark, that goes to show you just how powerful individualism really is, right? It's not about you. It's about, these larger discussions. But yeah, I think that, having white people, involved with psychedelic work that helps them to deal with white supremacy is precisely what needs to happen. I mean, I think we can get more whites there quicker, right? With less resistance, particularly if it's done in a controlled fashion under strict protocol.
Yeah, and then I see there's a part 3 to this question, which is great. I'm very interested in this type of research, and I'm wondering if you know of any studies or clinicians concluding that psychedelics are a viable treatment for white supremacy disorder.
There are currently no studies that I know of that is even looking at that. However, there is some interest in that, some interest in having groups of whites with other whites in different locations across the country that have these, who are interested in doing or running an MDMA, assisted therapy as part of the phase 3 trial that MAPS is doing. Let me know. Reach out to me. I'll leave my email address here when we conclude this discussion, and then please reach out to me. But I would like to. In fact, that's one of my areas I'd like to see. I think it would be wonderful. I really do. I think it would be really, really, and I think that because whites have so much, white people already have a major market share when it comes to psychedelics, when it comes to the marijuana, when it comes to all of these substances and compounds. Whites have ample access to them than other communities. So why not try? I mean, right now there's a lot of clinical trials being done, but they're not being done specifically looking at this issue. But that would be a very, very good research project to take up. And so please reach out to me at the end of this.
And then there's kind of a similar question. Do you foresee an opportunity for community-based psychedelic supported spaces, but specifically a second part about group sessions for unpacking this conditioning? So maybe what you talked about, as well as maybe with whites and members of the BIPOC community.
Yes, absolutely. So I've been talking to Bia about this, and we've had some conversations about this. And so we're kind of in the early stages of this discussion, because of course the pandemic has really made it very difficult for us to do anything really until this pandemic is under control. But yes, this is something these discussions are currently happening. And so we're trying to figure out a way to make that happen. And I'm wondering, audience, if you're out there listening to me, how many of you would be interested in doing this, something like this? Just by a show of hand. Is there a digital hand they can raise?
Yeah, they can see? Yeah, drop what you think in the chat, folks who are watching.
That would be fantastic. Then that would give us a good idea of if there's even interest in this. This is a really cool idea. It's a radical idea.
I'm interested.
Thanks, Ariel. Ariel, I know you can
Yeah,
hang
for
out with
sure.
us. And see, Ariel, you would be one of the folks that would be helping, lead folks through the discussion, and sort of facilitating these discussions as well. So I think that having, I'm trying. So Bia, that's my girl, y'all. I love Bia, and so Bia is doing some amazing things, and this is one of the areas that we are talking about. And so stay tuned on this, but I would like to see, again, by show of digital hands,
But
if there's even interest for
so
it.
many, they're just coming up, and everyone
Oh,
is saying,
fantastic. That's
yeah.
fantastic. These are see, this is why I like this kind of work can be so transformative. Okay, so let me
Okay.
get back to this. I'm gonna say this one last thing, Ariel. I was saying this real quick. I mentioned alexithymia. If I didn't, I'll mention it now. Alexithymia is a diagnostic term you see in the DSM-5. It talks about folks not having empathy, right? So so white folks, we talk about white delusion. It's this sort of white group alexithymic moment of not having empathy, group empathy, right? So we need to change that and make it more general across the board.
I'm going to offer in the chat that folks can email me, and then I can get the group of people who are interested in participating together, and then I'll reach out to you, just so we can take some action. Okay, so back to some questions. Do you think that legalization of substances such as cannabis has any influence in police violence, or it would only result in a lesser rate of BIPOC people incarcerated, if that?
I think both. I think one of the issues that the stereotypes associated with Black drug use, right? Blacks and whites use drugs equally about the same, right? But generally, Blacks are disproportionately targeted for drug use because of the pernicious lies and historical half-truths that were taught about Black people as being more criminal, more violent, and of course, along with that is the drug thug, the drug lord, and all these other metaphors associated with the Black body. So yes, and yes for both of those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Also wondering if there could be programs for military, law enforcement, or those who replace them in an abolitionist future, and other armed forces to engage with healing medicines and transform.
This is why I love this doggone community. That is so the applications for what I'm talking about, what we're all thinking about here, clearly what we're all thinking about is endless. And you're exactly right. These communities are I would argue disproportionately, have a disproportionate number of folks in them that harbor these ideas, that have these feelings about difference. And so yes, these would be great communities to do this. So we need to get together a group, a consortium, to start working toward legalizing these substances so we can actually use them in therapeutic ways. Because let me tell you something, I've been prescribing medication for years, and I've not seen this sort of hype around these substances from major medical organizations. I've never seen that before. And we've seen two major pieces come out recently in two major medical publications looking at the impressiveness of psilocybin and the amazing properties of MDMA. I mean, so I think that legalization, or at least taking these substances off the controlled substance list, Schedule 1 is like not usable in humans, please. Cannabis is on Schedule 1, the federal drug schedule, DEA drug list. That needs to change. And so in addition to spearheading some of these experiences, we need to still consider decriminalizing these compounds so they can be used in BIPOC communities and also in white communities, for the purposes of helping us see our own humanity, to see how deeply connected we are to one another, and the foolishness of our thinking, and how our thinking can be weaponized and cause us so much suffering and cause so much grief that we've seen, since for at least in this country, this country came into existence. So there's a lot of work to be done. Lots of applications, great questions, great comments.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to squeeze in one question that I have. It was, I appreciated very much that you talked about epigenetics and ancestral trauma, and along the lines of, the knowing of interconnectedness when we come from certain cultural points of views and community lenses versus sort of the like hyper individualism that is in this dominant white society. And also thinking about children and, the kind of suffering that unfortunately is passed along through lineage because of trauma. And I was just kind of curious about what you've seen in your work for healing ancestral trauma and sort of what comes with our epigenetic, I guess, what our inheritance or something.
So what neuroscience has taught us or suggested is that the brain is plastic. It doesn't matter how old you are. The thinking was when you hit 18, the brain no longer changes. But we know now that the epigenetic processes in our bodies begins through the electrical domain of the brain. And so the transference of these specific epigenetic tags, these methylated processes that exist within DNA, it alters DNA, it changes the way that the light switch comes on and off. Cells turn on and off based upon the environment. Our cells listen to the environment. They hear the environment, and they adjust to that. So generations of trauma and generations of abuse affect the way our DNA operates, or the way in which these cells express themselves. So oftentimes when people have these epigenetic tags, they're more susceptible to diseases of slow accumulation, such as heart disease, cancers, strokes, mental health disorders, often in the form of childhood trauma. Everybody's familiar with ACEs, I'm sure, and the ACEs criteria for how many ACEs one person is exposed to. ACEs speaks to the idea of accumulated or adverse childhood experiences, things from abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, to seeing someone, having a loved one locked up and incarcerated, to someone seeing a police officer shoot someone, or having a family member shoot someone, or seeing someone get shot, or having a family member abused, a parent that's abused by another parent. These experiences really, really wreak havoc on our bodies, particularly our brains, which organize themselves around electricity. So specifically the 5 domains, theta, beta, alpha, delta. So what we know is that if we can alter the way that the mother, the primary caregiver, and the infant interact within the womb, oftentimes this is where these epigenetic tags are transferred. Through in utero, is transferred through the experiences that's happening with the mother. If the mother is stressed out, has a high degree of stress, then enzymes responsible for deactivating cortisol, the enzyme, the hormone that increases as a result of stress, right, is not able to do its function through the placenta and deactivate cortisol, which means that inside the uterine environment where fetuses live, right, there's a high degree of stress hormones. Right? That causes the baby to kick more and to fuss more, colicky, and so on and so forth. And this affects them until they get 2. And I'm saying all this to say, if we can train the brain and transform or recondition the way in which the mother's brain waves are expressing themselves, we can actually change the way the baby experiences that as well, and cut the umbilical cord, so to speak, of intergenerational trauma for good. I'm not sure if there's anything that I know. I know that psychedelics possess the properties to facilitate neuroplasticity as well. Training the brain gets us there, equidistance to MDMA or psilocybin. In fact, I would even recommend that they both are useful, because one opens the envelope, the other retrains the brain so that you have lasting effects that last for a lifetime or at least it lasts until our spirits are transformed into energy. That was a long and roundabout way. So yes, I believe very fervently, and the research is indicating that we can change the epigenetic markers that we continue to pass down from generation to generation. We can do it.
Yeah.
The science is there.
Yeah, thank goodness. And okay, one final question, even though I know we're a minute over, but I want to honor people who have put their questions in the chat. How can we fight for decriminalization while simultaneously resisting their commercialization? Another common resource, patrimony that capital will enclose as private property.
This is the messiness of the system that we conduct our political, our economic, our legal affairs. Yeah, this is the messiness of a democracy. The questions that you're asking, the two warring ideas existing at one time. I mean, that's the story of democracies. That's the story of Western civilization. So if I can answer that question, I would, I'd be a transcendent being. I think there's a lot of policy making that needs to happen. There's a lot of changing of the narrative that needs to happen in order for us to get to the place where I think you're suggesting in the question that you asked. There's a lot of soul searching and a lot of changing hearts and minds. We talk so much about changing other people's hearts and minds. We can change our own hearts and minds. And so in order to get to a place where I think we need to go, but we're nowhere near that. So I'm hopeful that we will. Now, this new generation, they seem to be a little bit more up on it than we are. My generation, certainly Generation X, which was, a continuation of the baby boomer generation. So I think that there's a little bit more tolerance and much more diversity amongst these newer generations of young people. That's wonderful, but we still haven't atoned. We still haven't had that truth and reconciliation that we desperately need in order to move forward as a society. We have to have that reckoning before we can really move forward. So we have to prepare people. If the reckoning is not going to happen from a federal perspective or a state perspective, then we have to start planting seeds of individuals where these reckonings can happen in micro dose bursts all over the country. We have to do something. Nothing is not an option.
Yeah. Well, I could talk to you forever, and I'm sure everyone else could, but that is all the time that we have. So thank you so much. Thank you. So grateful.
I'm going to put my information in the chat box. If anyone is interested, feel free to reach out to me. I really appreciate you sticking around. It's very rare that white people stay around, but I'm glad that you all did. For those who are white. Here's my, when people say, oh, you don't like white people. Some of my best friends are white. And this is supposed to make you laugh because this is what we often hear, white people saying about, black people. So this is supposed to make you laugh. I've got a lot of those actually. Here's my email. And reach out to me. You can find me at the University of Memphis in the Department of Sociology. Please, you can find me there if you're interested there, or you can find me on Twitter or any of those other places. This is my Twitter handle at Dr. Darren Smith. Some people call me a cochologist or a white people whisperer. I don't know if that sticks or really works, but if it's helpful, then I'll own it. I'll take it.
Well, thank you so much. You will be hearing from many of us who are interested in participating in the type of community building and inner looking and the healing that we so desperately need. We can all feel it in our whole selves. So thank you so much for all the work.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Really honor you.